Is Adobe still the king of design software in 2025? In this video, we're gonna take Adobe's heavy hitters and compare it to the new challenges to see whether Adobe still wears the design software crown. And wait till the end, because there is an area of design software that Adobe has already been knocked off the throne. Hiya, I am Dan Scott. I have been a graphic designer for more than 15 years now. And the whole time, I've been using Adobe software. I think pretty sure at one point I was the most certified Adobe instructor in the world. So I know Adobe, and in this teaching role, people come to me all the time like, hey, what about this other software? What about this one? Is it better? Is it worse? And I don't know, over the years, I like to explore these other products. I like to roll up my sleeve, figure it out. Are these actually better? Am I gonna switch to this? Is the industry switching to these? And that's what I wanna do in this video. Compare the product, show the alternatives, and then let you know, would I swap? Should you swap? Yeah, let's jump in. So the first app we're gonna look at is Photoshop. We know and love it. It is primarily a photo editing app, but it gets used a lot in the kind of full design industry using type. It also gets used for a bit of web design. So the strengths of Photoshop, it is amazing at the hard stuff. So photo compositing, retouching, it's really good for. One of the big perks is kind of interoperability across all of the Adobe apps. Its AI is one of the few that's commercially safe, so that's a big strength for it. And it's still kind of the industry standard when you are looking for work. So there are a bunch of competitors to Photoshop, but there's a couple of main ones. The main one we're gonna cover first is Canva. So what is Canva? It is not like a complete direct replacement for Photoshop, but people are using it for Photoshop style things. So it is mainly a broad tool set of design tools that does a bit of Photoshop's job. Its strengths, it is really easy to learn and use. It is free or cheap to use. One of its biggest perks is that it kind of comes preloaded with a lot of good looking templates you can kind of just work from. Brand kits are really important when you're working inside of a company, and that is really strong in Canva. And it's probably its biggest perk is its versatility. It does some of the Photoshop stuff, but it also does some of the video editing, some of the print stuff, does some of the web stuff. That is probably its key feature. It's very versatile. In terms of the weaknesses, it only does really simple photo editing. So you can do simple adjustments. It's great for stock photography, but if you got your own stuff that really needs some work, it's probably not the app for you. And it only has a one-click selection. That just means, like, we know in Photoshop, if you've used it, you make a selection and you've got 20 other selection tools to help you refine that selection. In Canva, you click the button. If it's good, it's good. If it's not so good. So they both have layers. Photoshop though has a lot more advanced layers. Layers in Canva are more like separations of separate things. Text over here, an image over here. Whereas Photoshop, you can have 100 layers that represent one image. Whereas Canva is a lot more boxes of content type layers. So should you switch to Canva? If you are primarily focused on social media, 100%. You're gonna be working with stock images, working with type, working fast. Canva is amazing. So I'd switch. If I was a freelancer or kind of like a business owner, and primarily the work is going to be digital and online, and you're not using it for your full-time tool, I'd switch as well. I'd be happy to switch to Canva. If I was a professional designer, would I switch? No. The trouble is when you get into projects that need a lot of compositing. So compositing is a fancy word where you've just got lots of different elements, all shot in different light spaces and different distances and angles and depths. Photoshop has that depth and breadth to the software to help you kind of get around those things. And also for me, in terms of AI in Canva is a fun toy. In Photoshop, it is the most serious tool doing artificial intelligence in terms of image production, especially when we need to work with clients that need commercially safe work. All right, so the next competitor, Affinity Photo. So Affinity Photo is a direct competitor for Photoshop. Canva, kind of parallel, kind of doing the same job. Affinity Photo, completely trying to do the same job. Now owned by Canva. So the strengths for Affinity Photo is the pricing. Okay, they do a one-off cost. You buy it for 70 bucks and you own it forever. And the other one is it's pretty easy to learn. The big difference between the two is that Photoshop made a feature, then made it better, but kept the old feature. Then made a new, better version of that and kept both of those old ones. Whereas Affinity Photo have just gone, We'll just take the one that everyone's using. So it's kind of like a cut down version, making it just easier. Instead of 10 options, there's one option. And it's really easy to switch because it's just Photoshop. It looks like Photoshop. They've used the same UI, the architecture's the same, the page furniture's all in the same place, even the same names used for things. So if you are switching, it feels very similar. And the nice thing as well is if you do decide, all right, Affinity Photo first, it's the right price for me right now, you can learn that, and it's a pretty easy switch to Photoshop as well. Okay, you can kind of graduate from Affinity Photo to Photoshop whenever you like. So the weaknesses for Affinity Photo is probably some of the AI selection. And when I mean by selection, I mean like, I need to grab this one thing and pull it away from the background and kind of isolate it from everything else. The AI that's built into Adobe, like they call it Sensei. I don't know, every time I use one of the selection tools, it's just much better. And I go to Affinity Photo and it's like Photoshop was a couple of years ago, still good, but just Adobe are at the forefront of that kind of AI mix with some of the kind of imagery that we're working with. So the other thing is that they've kind of like taken the 80% that everyone uses and kind of tidied it up so it's a little simpler. The trouble is when you need that last 20%. And it's always my job that needs that 20%, that weird feature. Those are the bits where you're like, all right, back to Photoshop I go. So would I switch? As a professional designer, I can't. I need all the bells and whistles. But if I was just using Photoshop alongside my workflow, amongst other things, I think I could totally switch. 80% of everything we do is most of it. And to summarize, if I'm working with kind of stock photography, simple type, working a lot in social, then I would use Canva. Canva is a total solution for you. If I need to go that next step and I've got my own images and they need better selecting and I need compositing, then Affinity Photo would be perfect. Especially if it's kind of one of the many tools that you're using as part of your kind of job. If you are doing any serious time in Photoshop, you'll know that you'll need all the bells and whistles, all the knobs, and that's why for me, personally, Photoshop's still the king. All right, next up, Adobe Illustrator. What is it used for? They call it vector drawing, but really it ends up getting used by illustrators, logo designers, people in branding. It gets used a lot for icons and posters and newsletters and stationery. That's its job. So it's amazing at typography. It has like really big depth of typography, kind of advanced controls where not just the simple type changes you can make, you can really pull apart type and customize it, use it for logos where you really kind of get in there and take ownership of the fonts. It's also a killer at pre-press, where you are getting things ready for print. Let's say a cereal box where we've got fold marks and crop marks and the colors need to be broken out into color levels. It's got to be CMYK. It is kind of essential for pre-press. And probably my favorite feature in Illustrator is the shape builder tool. It's kind of one of those tools in there that really saves the day. It's a way of combining shapes without making it complicated. It's nice and simple, great results. So its biggest weakness is probably its intimidation. You ever opened it? If you're out there and you're like, oh, it's too much. It's not very intuitive. Once you get to know it, great, but it can be really intimidating to get started. All right, competitor number one is Affinity Designer, now owned by Canva. Affinity Designer is a direct replacement for Illustrator. It does a lot of the same jobs. The strengths, it's basically like Illustrator. Like they did with Affinity Photo and Photoshop, they went and copied Illustrator. Affinity Designer looks the same kind of layout, same kind of visual language. They've gone and taken the kind of 80% that everybody uses and removed the rest and tidied up the interface. One of my favorite things about Affinity Designer is they do this kind of nice vector and kind of pixel workflow where we've got these kind of like linear lines, vector goodness, and the kind of more pixels that we're used to in Photoshop. And they've got a really nice way of kind of flicking between the two. I find that a lot of my work has both of those features. What Adobe does is they split it quite heavily down the middle. Photoshop, you do this. Illustrator, you do vector. Whereas Affinity Designer, they're really good at kind of balancing the two. The other perk is the price. It's $70, you can own it outright, get all the updates. The other thing is you can wrap it up with Affinity Photo, combine those two, add Publisher, which we'll talk about in a second, and you get the whole thing for $180. So would I switch? If I was a casual user using it kind of small part, getting started, you could use either. They're very comparable. As a professional though, would I change? Yeah, as long as I'm using Illustrator in a kind of a general purpose vector drawing kind of situation, works perfect. If you're like me, you end up kind of complicated pre-press work, then no, you still need Illustrator. And if you're a freelancer, the trouble happens is when you are looking for kind of commercial work at an agency or a big company, they're gonna want basically nothing but Illustrator skills. All right, the next alternative for Illustrator is Corel Draw. So it's very comparable to Adobe Illustrator, does the same vector drawing features that Illustrator has. The strengths is actually it has a mildly simpler interface, kind of a little bit easier to get started. And its other strength is pre-press. We talked about it in Illustrator where Affinity Designer wasn't as good as Illustrator. Corel Draw is actually better. It's kind of like more honed for that pre-press bleed lines and fold lines and getting things ready for commercial printers. That is its big perk. Weaknesses, it doesn't have the same kind of automaticness of Illustrator. Some of the AI stuff in Illustrator is just way better than Corel. The other thing is it's quite expensive. Costs like $270 a year as a subscription. You can buy it one-off for like $550, but really expensive. So would I switch? If I was like a logo designer or a freelance or an illustrator, you could totally be happy in Corel, but there's probably just a couple of features that would probably keep you over in Illustrator, but you could make Corel work. If you are a small business owner and you're kind of like doing the odd bit of your own work, then no, Corel's not for you. And to be fair, I don't think Illustrator is right for you either. Probably something like Canva or Adobe Express would be better suited to your needs. And the one area that I would switch is if you're working kind of any sort of time in pre-press, kind of working with commercial printers, getting things built and sizably printed in kind of an industrial setting. That's where I think Corel would be a better switch. Alternative number 3 for Illustrator is weirdly Figma. Figma is a strange one where it's primarily a UX design tool, but people are using it like Illustrator. And it comes up far too often to ignore it as a competitor to Illustrator because it does a lot of what Illustrator does. Primarily, its tool is UX design. So that is building apps and building websites. That's kind of its main job and testing those things. That's its goal. But people are using it for logo and simple type. The 50% of stuff that you do in Illustrator, you can just do in Figma. The strengths for Figma are like the pen tool. If you've ever tried to tackle that in any vector drawing program, it's hard. Figma rethought that thing and it is super easy to use. Not the depth, but man, you can get started real quick. The other strength is that for the web and app designs that I'm doing in Figma, my normal workflow would be use Illustrator, create the graphics, lay them out in Figma, add the buttons, add the interactivity, do the testing via it. And I don't know, lately I've worked out that most of the things I'm doing in Illustrator, things like digital ads, YouTube thumbnails, website graphics, hero graphics, I can actually have most of the tools in Figma and it just kind of cuts that one step out. So the biggest shortcoming for Figma in comparison to Illustrator is its lack of any sort of pre-press. Okay, so if you need to deal with CMYK or folds or anything that's getting printed in the real world, Figma does not know what to do with it. So would I switch if I was a logo designer, a freelance graphic designer, maybe a small business owner? 100% no. It doesn't have the depth that you need to do any of those jobs really well. But the one place you would switch if you have any inkling in UX design, 100%. We used to do a lot of our kind of UI, UX work in Illustrator. Figma now is 100% better. Would I switch personally? No, I need them both. I do too many complex logo designs and icons, and then I bring them into Figma. Simple stuff, perfect. I need Figma, but I still need Illustrator. All right, next on the list, Adobe InDesign. So what is InDesign? It is good at desktop publishing. Things like magazines and books and newsletters and flyers and stationery and digital publishing, things like ebooks and EPUBs. So the strengths for InDesign, it is got very, very complex typography controls. It is brilliant at some of the digital publishing formats. It's really good with kind of automation and kind of connecting it with databases and all sorts of nerdy stuff like that. So it's really good at some of the larger complex documents, things like big catalogs and big spec manuals. Also like really large books. I'm sure Lord of the Rings, which sits massive on my desk, which I haven't actually read yet, was all set out in InDesign. And its weakness is a lot like Photoshop and Illustrator. It was built a long time ago, and it has piled the features up over the years, which makes it a little intimidating to get into. So alternative number 1 for InDesign is Affinity Publisher. It's part of that same group of Affinity Photo and Designer. Publisher is a direct kind of copy of InDesign, very similar format. So the strengths for Affinity Publisher is that because it's kind of a recent enough product, it hasn't got that kind of back catalog of huge amounts of features. They're kind of taking a new slice out of it now, which makes it a little bit more approachable. One of the big weaknesses for me is that when it comes to digital publishing, it just doesn't have all the tools required to do some of the EPUB work, and definitely the interactive PDF stuff. Affinity Publisher just doesn't do it at all. So if used InDesign for any kind of advanced features, you will have bumped into grep styles, okay, which is code-based styles where you change things in a document. Affinity Publisher doesn't do it. Same thing with data merge. Data merge is when you connect, say, let's just say for simple, a CSV, some sort of comma-separated simple database, and then populate the document. That's something that InDesign does way better. All right, so would I switch from a casual user, or am a designer doing things like, I don't know, like a newsletter for a company or an annual report, things like that? Perfect. Affinity Publisher is great at it. Where you would still need InDesign is anybody working just with larger documents, complex connections with things like databases and all that kind of geeky stuff. InDesign still has the win for that one. So alternative number 2 for Adobe InDesign is QuarkXPress. Who remembers this? This is like the OG of desktop publishing. I learned in it. And basically InDesign was the up and comer. And we were doing the, should I switch from QuarkXPress to InDesign? Now, it's the other way around. Should I go back to QuarkXPress? So its strength is working with kind of complex documents. Like where Affinity lacks some of the tools to work with tricky situations, this is where Quark excels. It's really good with dynamic content, things that are coming from databases or other software library and kind of updating in real time and those types of things. Quark is great at. Where it's not so good is the cost. It is $220 a year. There's no monthly subscription. Where it's also not very good is its user interface. It's pretty tricky to use. It's the OG, so it lacks some of the kind of niceties of modern software. Would I switch? If I was a freelancer or a kind of casual user, using it to do that one thing amongst other work, not for you. Quark is really focused towards complex kind of desktop publishing. And if I was a professional designer, it's still a no. It is being left behind by InDesign. InDesign has, I think, a fuller or at least a comparable feature set, and it's just not used as much in the industry. But if you end up at a job that uses QuarkXPress, I'd be happy in it. It's totally capable, but I wouldn't switch. Sorry, Quark users. I know some of you will be hating me in the comments. I love you. I started with Quark, but now I'm an InDesign guy. So when it comes to competitors, some of the other software have some pretty close competitors, but with InDesign, it's basically InDesign or nothing. All right, the fourth and final, we're gonna talk about Adobe Express. So what is Adobe Express? Well, it was formerly Adobe Spark, if you remember that, and it's kind of aimed at more casual designers. People that are on the periphery of kind of design as well. Things like marketing departments will use Express, designers themselves as well. And its kind of output is things like anything kind of social media related. So the strengths for Adobe Express, it is relatively cheap. It's like $9.95 a month. It also connects really well with all of the other tools, things like Photoshop and Illustrator. There's a great interoperability with these. It has great AI tools built into it. It's really good with brand assets, things like logos and fonts and colors, keeping those consistent. It also does some basic publishing, kind of like Google Docs or Word does that pretty well as well. It's kind of like the jack of all design tools. And the competitor to Adobe Express is Canva. Why do we even need Adobe Express and Canva if their job, like I've already talked about it before, they do the first part of the design job really well, but nothing else. Why do we even bother? For me, as a professional designer, why I bother is this kind of client relationship. My value to my customer is in the positioning and getting everything ready and kind of working through the problems. And once that's done, I don't want a call from Bob every second week saying, I need to change the price. You know, the addresses needs updating. That's not where I bring value. And often while I'll turn down work because I don't want those small jobs because of that pain. This software, either Express or Canva, allows me to get everything ready and then empower the client. They don't need a lot of training and they can actually do their own work. And it just makes my life so much easier. Even for friends, they're like, can you do this job for me? You're like, yeah, actually, I'll give you a Canva doc. And it allows me to kind of like get involved in jobs that I might not have before, but because I can kind of offset and give them the tools, it makes life so much better as a professional. All right, but if I had to pick one, Adobe Express or Canva, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. I use Canva. Why? Because most people use Canva and I'm more likely to find a client at the moment that has already trained themselves in Canva from some other designer or themselves. It's just way more popular. So yeah, I just picked the popular one. But if you're using Express going, should I switch? 100% not. Adobe Express is totally copying everything that Canva does and they're doing it just as good. So yeah, it doesn't matter. And the one tool that Adobe have lost the crown for completely is a UX design tool. But I remember Adobe XD, they had that and they were in the game. It was pretty good. They were competing with the likes of Figma and InVision and Sketch, and there were a few others, and they were battling it out for who was going to be the best. And then Adobe said, goodbye XD. What they wanted to do was cut XD because they planned on buying Figma. What they were trying to do was say, no, DOJ, we don't have any sort of UX design tool. This is definitely not going to be a monopoly. So they killed it, planning to buy Figma for like $20 billion. And then they said, it's a monopoly, you're not allowed to buy it. And Adobe were left with zero. So if you're looking for a UX design tool, there's basically only, there's only one. You could be using Sketch, nothing wrong with it. But really, if you're gonna get into UX now, you are going to be using Figma. All right, to wrap it up, I think the biggest moat that Adobe has and why I haven't switched is you've seen some of these software individually, there's some really good competitors, really comparable. For me though, as a kind of a professional designer, especially somebody who's like all over the, I love working on this project and this kind of project and this, I'm over here. I do need all these bits of software. I need the Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, but I also need some video and I need some 3D. That's where I think the Creative Cloud license is, that's where it brings a lot of value, a lot of connectivity, and also kind of under one price. Now I've talked about value for Adobe, and that's the biggest pain point for everybody is like the price. It is too expensive is what I hear. And I understand that. For me as a professional, the way that I think about it is I look at what I need to do my job. I need me, I need coffee, I need a laptop. The only thing else I need in the world is some Adobe software. And I just think of what I pay for that, for what goes into it from the Adobe company, what I get from it, and the value that I can create from that. I just feel like I am getting a good bargain out of it. So would I switch? If I'm a casual user using small parts of the creative suite, then yeah, I'd be looking to find something that was comparable, that was cheaper. But if I'm a professional designer with lots of different projects going on, Adobe's still the king. All right, and if any of the tools here that we've talked about pique your interest and you want to learn more, I've probably got a course on it. There'll be a link in the description for that. But that is going to be it. I will see you in the next video. Bye.